and it hits me, oh my gosh, this is that triangle.
You know, there's explanation for everything that occurred in the Rendlesham Forest incident that doesn't involve aliens at all.
It was completely silent. It comes right over our heads.
He saw a classic flying saucer, really, standing in the clearing.
He turned over to my father and held his hand, and he looked in his eyes, and he said, "We're not alone."
Welcome to Podcast UFO for our live show. We're live every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on the Dark Matter Radio Network. Please remember to visit the website podcastufo.com for past episodes, blogs, and forums. During the show, feel free to participate live in our chat room. And don't forget to like us on our very active Facebook page.
Hello and welcome to the show. This is Martin Willis, your host, and we have a good one coming up for you tonight. We have Dr. Kevin Randle. He is going to be talking about his book, The UFO Dossier, 100 Years of Government Secrets, Conspiracies, and Cover Ups. And I got into this book, and it's a good one. You're going to love it. So he'll be on for the full show. Before he comes up, we have Alejandro Rojas. And I want to thank all the people out there that are supporting the show. If you want to listen to the full show, you can sign up for $1 a month or more. And January 1st, that goes up to $2 a month. So if you want to be grandfathered in forever and ever at $1 a month, you can sign up at podcastufo.com. Just click on the menu bar, support the show. That's it for me. We are ready to roll with Alejandro. How are you?
Good. And you know what? I would like to throw something in for more content.
Sure.
If you subscribe to Martin's show, you get our show 2 for 1. You get our show. I'll throw it in there. Free.
Wow. Really?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. How about that? And you just have to go to openminds.tv.
Yeah. Yep. There you go.
Wow.
So subscribe now, people.
Thank you. That's very generous of you, Alejandro.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All right.
So other stuff you'll find there is some UFO news.
Yeah, and let's talk about what we got going on this week.
Okay, cool. It's been a couple weeks. You felt that I didn't make the cut for last week, but you have a high bar, so I understand. But there's some cool news. This is in particular something I wanted to share with you, which was the CIA panel. So this is cool. On October 9th, I think it was the 9th. It was just a couple of weeks ago. I didn't even know about this. I think I told you before. I've spoke a couple times at the Atomic Testing Museum. I've gone out there for their UFO talks. And the reason, and this is in Las Vegas, the reason they have UFO talks is because they have a UFO Area 51 exhibit that actually has a lot of information about UFOs, interestingly, even though this is a Smithsonian museum. Anyway, this is probably one of the coolest panels they've had. They had a group of CIA guys talking about Area 51. And lucky for us, well, it was George Knapp of KLAS in Las Vegas, the guy who pretty much put Area 51 on the map, you know, with Bob Lazar. Mm-hmm. He covered the Bob Lazar story. Anyway, luckily, Jeremy Corbell was there, who you've had on your show before, and he asked some of the UFO questions. And so it was really interesting. Some stupid comments made by the CIA guys.
Right.
One of them was that, you know, there is nothing secret at Area 51. Everybody knows about it, which is kind of silly because it was only recent that they've even admitted the name Area 51. George Knapp did push him and said, well, you guys can't keep secrets, right? You can't keep secrets. Come on. And one of the guys said, I will neither confirm nor deny that we can keep secrets. And Jeremy got him to say they don't research Area 51 or UFOs anymore. But he said, there is a Site 4 on Area 51, right? An S4. And the two guys, you know, the historian and one of the engineers who worked there were like, no. But one of the other workers who has been more forthcoming said, oh, yeah, there's a Site 4. There's so the good thing is what's interesting is that they had confirmed there is an S4 of some sort. He said it was some kind of storage or something like that. So he didn't say it was, you know, some secret base where they, you know, underground place where they look at alien spacecraft, like Bob Lazar says, but it's the first time on record I think I've heard where there was an S4, so that's kind of exciting.
It is. Now, does that actually help confirm a little bit of Bob Lazar's story?
I don't know.
Opinion?
The hard part is that they said it was a storage area, not. And in fact, Jeremy said he's been told that there are several Site 4s, that there are other names. In fact, I think they even said there's a Site 4 that's called Area 52 or something like that, or in Area 52. So it seems like it was a common term used. There are Site 4s in the area. Does that? I don't know. If it really gets us anywhere except for maybe it does, at least that there is an S4, and it was suspicious, that these guys lied. It's great because George Knapp has a video where he covers the whole thing, and he reminds people that the CIA is not here about, they weren't created to tell us the truth, that their whole thing is deception. Yeah,
the
great
one thing,
video.
Last week we had Michael Shermer on the show, and one thing I totally agree with what he said many times, actually, is the government lies to us. He actually said that, which I was kind of surprised, but it's totally true. And this is actually one of my favorite George Knapp investigative reports that I've seen. It's a real good one. I have that video right up on podcastufo.com. It's down on a blog on the homepage. Also, you can see links to this in the show notes, as well as all the stories we're covering today. On Podcast UFO, that'll jump right over to the original stories over at openminds.tv.
Yep, thanks. Yeah, we covered it on the UFO report, and then with an interview with Jeremy, and then we also, on our story, I did put Jeremy's videos of that whole conversation too, which is really cool. So,
great.
Yeah, great story.
Yeah, all right. So that's all on the same page as the original report that you did?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Yep. Yeah, so another fun story that is from the Siberian Times. This is kind of a cool one. This is a story about a UFO sighting recently where this lady said she saw a large dish-shaped object with a bunch of green lights and multicolored lights, essentially. But she said her and her son were watching it with some passerbys, and then this thing moved close to them. And when it did, these two men who were looking at it got scared, and they ran away, and they ran into a building. And she said she was just looking at it in awe. She says, I couldn't believe that something like this exists. And then her son grabbed her hand, and they ran away. So it was big enough and close enough that they really freaked out about it. This was in a town called Ulan-Ude, and this is near a lake. It's Lake Baikal, and there's a lot of sighting reports near this lake. So there were other reports nearby of strange lights. Earlier, there was a sighting that had taken place in the area where this guy said he saw some green lights, and this was in 2010 actually, and in the story there were pictures of these lights. There's another gentleman who took pictures of red lights years earlier. That's also in the story, and there's some pretty interesting pictures, but just kind of a neat story. Also, a ring was seen, and they think it could be a UFO. And there's a picture in the story, but it's unclear where the picture actually comes from. If it is the sighting, that they're writing about, but it's an interesting picture. Some people have noted that it looks more like a cloud or something, and they're probably right. But the other pictures are really interesting. So, yeah, I guess this lake, which turns out to be the largest freshwater lake, it is something like 5,000 feet deep.
Wow.
Yeah, huge.
That's amazing. I've never heard of a lake that deep. That's crazy.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, in Siberia, you think of, I want to say, Dyatlov Pass incident. That wasn't really about a UFO, but, that was speculation that it was a Yeti or UFO or something like that. And that's a real mysterious case. That's in the Ural Mountains. And we are trying, here at the Podcast UFO, we've been talking with a Russian person right there. right near that pass that lives right there. He's a UFO investigator, and we're trying to get him on the show. But there are a lot of, in Siberia, there are quite a few sightings, and that's really why I want to get this guy on the show.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what was great about this story is, it doesn't make fun of all of these sightings. It talks about multiple sightings. It has a couple pictures from a television show that was done in the area. In particular, it was covering a similar disc UFO sighting from 1990. So, yeah, it seems like a lot of UFO stories. And it's always fun to hear the Russian stuff because some of those countries, especially the eastern countries, we don't hear a lot from.
Right. And they take it, the conversations I had when I was in Russia, I tried to connect to see if I could actually speak to someone there in the town I was in because there was a lot of sightings there. And but the one thing as far as I could get, it wasn't really that far, but I did get connected through people in England that knew people in Russia and stuff like that. They really do take the topic very seriously there.
Mm-hmm.
It's
cool.
There's not a big a bunch of ridicule about it or debunking and all that. They take it serious.
Not like these goofy Americans, huh?
Yeah.
Like this Shermer guy.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, what a character. So another UFO sighting from another country, a country we hear a lot from, the Brits, is a story that we have from Roger Marsh. So this was a MUFON sighting. Of course, we love our British friends. We have a lot of listeners, I know, with open minds that are from the UK. Do you also?
Yes, it's the second most listened to in Google Analytics. For sure.
It's fun. And Australians, and it's so much
they're
fun.
About third or fourth, and Australia only has like 2 million people.
Yeah,
Something
so
like
it's
that.
fun.
Yeah.
It's so fun to be talking to these people. So this is for our British friends. This is a sighting that happened about 2:55 p.m. on July 5th. And, of course, we always say in Britain, and we don't say where. It says London time here. In fact, so I guess it's in London. I didn't know where it's from, to be honest. I apologize for that. But it's called, the person said they believed it was shape-shifting. And essentially in the video, this person spots something, a little black dot way up in the sky, and it's something moving slowly in one direction. And as it moves in front of a cloud, you can see the object is there. And it's just some small object moving slowly across the sky. So it's hard to say what it is. It's not a bird, I don't think, because it's moving smoothly and steadily. I suppose it could be a balloon. They say shape-shifting because the witness did take a couple of the pictures from the video and zoom in, and it looks like a different shape in each. And one, it kind of looks like a disc shape, and another, it looks almost like it's hard to say, almost like a jellyfish kind of shape. But that could be due to the camera shaking. It could be some kind of motion blur, because when you watch the video, you see it is kind of moving and a bit. So, but it's interesting. Don't know what it is. It's a nice video, and it's kind of an interesting sighting.
Yeah, you have in the past, you hear about people actually making a reference to jellyfish in UFOs. I've heard that a number of times.
Yeah, this one seems more solid, but sometimes the jellyfish-looking UFOs are a bit translucent. Not like this one's opaque. It's a dark one, but you're right. That is something that is seen or described occasionally. And some of those, I think, are pretty interesting.
Right. Is that it for tonight, or we got one more?
That's it.
All right, so thanks so much, and we'll be talking to you next week, Alejandro.
Sounds good. Talk to you later, buddy.
All right, so hang in, everyone, for the quick music break here, and we'll be right back with Dr. Kevin Randle. That music's by Carrie Lloyd Whitehouse. And I want to just make a correction here. I was just corrected in the chat room. Australia does not have 2 million people. It has 23 million people, which is still not a lot of people for the mass of the land that is there. And sorry about that. We have a live listener down in Australia right now. Just let me know I made a boo-boo. So, Kevin Randle, are you there?
I be here.
All right. Welcome back to the show, I should say.
Well, thank you. Can I interject one thing about the CIA and Area 51?
Oh, okay. Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
They're talking about S4, and they said it was a storage area.
Mm-hmm.
In the military, the S4 is the supply officer. And I don't know if there's any connection there or not. It's just that it's a military base or an Air Force base, so referring to the area as the S4 but might just be nothing more exotic than that. I don't know.
Okay. All right. So this could be a misconstrued thing going on here, is what you're saying, as far as when they answered that question?
Yeah, it could easily be something that, because he said it was storage, and I'm thinking, S4, that makes sense to me militarily, but it just might be a coincidence too. I don't know if that's an answer or not. I just thought I'd interject that for whatever it's worth.
Yeah, but he did say there was one or two S4s. That could be one or two supply officers as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. But
Okay.
but the as I say, in the Army, for example, the S4 is the supply officer, S2 is intelligence, S3 is operations, and S1 is the personnel guy.
I know we're going to be talking about your book here in a minute, and I don't really like to. Well, it's a little bit controversial asking this question right off the bat, but. I go back, and I have right from the very beginning gone back and forth with Bob Lazar's story, and I just don't know what to think. Sometimes it seems like more things come forward. It makes you wonder a little bit more about the possibilities, and like some of the stuff he talks about seems to, make sense or come true, but I just don't know what to think. And I might as well ask, this book kind of that you've written recently kind of explores a lot of things similar to this, and I just wondered if you would like to share an opinion.
I'm kind of ambivalent as you are. I don't really know. I know George Knapp, and he's very careful and a very good researcher.
Yes.
And he doesn't seem to have any qualms about Bob Lazar, seems to accept what he says. So and because of that, I'm a little bit ambivalent about it as well. It seems that, Lazar inflated his academic credentials.
Right.
But an awful lot of people have done that.
That's true. It's pretty solid that he did go to MIT only because he didn't know about the square that was right outside the door, when he was questioned in a live audience. And I don't know, it's not Kenmore Square, it's another square. But everyone that goes to MIT knows that, So it's possible he didn't go to MIT. Like you said, he may have just inflated his education background. Who knows?
And when you talk about Army aviation and flying helicopters, for example, there's all kinds of terminology that those of us who have done it know, and those who haven't don't really know. And one of the things I think of is the helicopters are set up so that the pilot in command, the aircraft commander, sits in the right seat, as opposed to the left seat as it is in an airplane. But in Vietnam, at least in the units I was in, the aircraft commander sat in the left seat because you had better outside vision from that seat. And so that's one of the little things, and I don't know if that was something universal to all aviation units in Vietnam, or if that was just something that the units I was involved with did, because I was in two units, but both part of the 269th Combat Aviation Battalion. So it might have been something that was just done in that battalion. It might have been something done in the group I was in. I just don't know. But that's one of the things that kind of keys me to some of these things. And the little squares above the pilots' heads in the Huey, we called those the greenhouses because they were green, and when you're sitting on the ground, the light beats down through it and makes it really hot in the cockpit. So it's those sorts of things mean something to everybody. So the fact you didn't know what the name of the square was is very revealing, because if you'd gone there, you'd have known that. And
that was Kendall Square, as that was just pointed out by a local that was in the chat room. And someone, makes kind of a good point. And it always makes you wonder when this happens is someone in the chat room mentioned that, he does not want to do interviews, and he kind of stays away from the whole thing as much as possible. And that may be, may give him a little bit of credibility, but also he may have gotten beat up a bit by, being in the limelight.
And I'm not sure that really adds to the credibility, because I can point to any number of witnesses who seem to be reluctant to grant interviews, but in the end they always seemingly do grant those interviews. So, I don't know.
Yeah.
Like I said, I'm ambivalent. I really don't know. I lean toward Lazar being somewhat credible simply because of George Knapp.
Right. I totally get that, and I have a lot of respect for George. Also, I think that, I heard through a friend of George that, I shouldn't even say this, but there are some questions here and there, and it really does make you wonder. And there's so many things that can be questioned, and a lot of these things are taken at face value and end up being a myth, and then hard to let go of a lot of times by certain people. That topic does come up on the show here and there. And
Brent Steiger said something to me a long time ago, which was that he tended to believe the people when they talked to him. He would accept their stories until he found out otherwise. He wouldn't just automatically reject what somebody says, but he gave them the benefit of the doubt. And I always thought that was kind of an interesting way to operate. Although if you're dealing with investigations, you really have to look at the things suspiciously, especially in today's world. I mean, when we began the Roswell investigation, we were talking to a lot of military people, and I just accepted what they said as being true simply because they were military. Frank Kaufman gave us copies of his discharge papers, and then when we got deeper into it, we found out that people were making stuff up. There's a book called Stolen Valor, and it's about all these guys who claim to have been Vietnam veterans and do all this stuff, and it turns out, they're lying about it. In the 1990 census, there was a question, are you a Vietnam veteran? And 13 million people said yes. There are 2.5 million Vietnam veterans, period. So 11 million people were lying about it. Wow. On the census form, which gained them absolutely nothing.
Isn't that amazing?
And you look at a lot of the stories of the atrocities committed in Vietnam, they're from guys who never served in Vietnam, never served in the Army. They're just making the stuff up because that gets them some sort of attention. And it, as me as a Vietnam veteran, that really annoys me. And if you go to various websites, you can actually prove that I was in Vietnam. There's the 187th Assault Helicopter Company website. And if you go to that, you can find my picture among the pilots who served in the unit. So, I mean, I can certainly prove that I was a Vietnam veteran. But a lot of guys say, well, my records were doctored, and they did this and they did that because all of the clandestine missions I was on, and most of it's a load of crap. So.
Wow.
There you go.
Yeah, I could see why that would rub you the wrong way. Now, getting back to Roswell, you mentioned just a minute ago, I had Michael Shermer on last week, and he had a lot of, he considered it a lot of bunk and said why. And part of what he said was that, I think, I can't say it verbatim, but there was a research of all the top UFO sightings through the late 40s and early 50s. It was done in 1960s, I believe he said, and there were something like 600 of them, and Roswell wasn't even on the list. And that was one of his reasons why Roswell never happened. And then he said, and all these people came forward. And so one of the things...
one of the biggest stories in July of 1947 was the crash in Roswell. If you go to the newspapers, it's a national story. It's a national story for 3 hours, but it's a national story. When you go to the Project Blue Book files, there's absolutely no mention of it in the files. The only thing I found, I think it's a sighting from July 10th. There's a newspaper clipping in it. It's a 4-paragraph newspaper clipping. It's very short, and the third paragraph refers to Lieutenant Warren Haight, whoever the hell he was, that's obviously Walter Haut, being issued a blistering rebuke for announcing they had a flying saucer. So Shermer's reasoning there is bogus because it was a big story for 24 hours. Mm-hmm. And once it came out as a weather balloon, well, nobody wanted to really talk about it. But the next day, this was announced on July 8th. The next day, there's all kinds of stories about how the Army and Navy moved to suppress stories of flying saucers whizzing through the atmosphere. So you look at this and you say, well, up to July 8th, they didn't care. There's all kinds of UFO stories. On July 9th, they say, well, we're trying to stop it, and the sightings fall off from there. So the reasoning, Shermer's reasoning for that is bogus. I mean, if you want to find reasons not to believe in Roswell, there's a lot of them. This just doesn't have to be a good one.
Yeah, and one of the things I said to him when he mentioned that all these people came forward as soon as the story broke in, what was it, 1980 or 1979, whenever that was?
1978, when Jesse Marcel was interviewed by, first by Stan Friedman, but then by Len Stringfield and I think it's Steve Tom for a radio station in Chicago, and from there it kind of broke from there. Pratt did his article for the National Enquirer, and then, of course, the Roswell incident came out in 1980. But a lot of the people didn't come forward. We went and found them, and one of the tools we had was the yearbook that was produced in 1947. So we got pictures of like 1,500 people who served in Roswell in July of 1947. Made it simple to find people, and I remember going through the list of MPs back in the olden days when the Internet was fairly new, and you could buy a CD-ROM with the phone books on it. And I remember going through that, looking up the names of the MPs to call them. Edwin Easley, the provost marshal, he did not come forward. I found him and called him. And so that's another bogus reason. Yeah, there's a lot of people who came forward, and a lot of people have been exposed for making up their stories of being involved in Roswell, but a lot of them didn't come forward. We went and found them. And, in fact, the last guy I talked to, I think it was in 2012. He was like 800 years old, had been a low-ranking enlisted man at Roswell, so he would have been 18, 19 years old in 1947, so he was still alive. I think he said he was 85. He didn't remember. He remembered something about it, but not a lot, and he was told at the time, you're supposed to forget everything about it. So he wasn't heavily involved. He just remembered that one little tidbit of information. So, again, people came forward, but a lot of them were actually found. We went out and found them because we had the yearbook, and I got the unit histories, and that gave us a list of more names of people who were there.
So, is that basically wrong in general? I mean, did some people come forward on their own, or was it all people that you went after?
Oh, absolutely, people came forward on their own. Once they learned that the story was of interest, once they learned other people were talking about it, they made contact with the International UFO Museum in Roswell. They made contact with the various researchers, Stan Friedman, Don Schmidt, me. They sought us out to tell us their stories. So, yes, that happened. But a lot of the people we went out and located. I remember we were looking for Robert Slusher, who was a member of one of the flight crews that supposedly flew some of the bodies out of Roswell. And Don had come up with a phone number for a Robert Slusher, and I called the guy, and he had been in the Army Air Forces during World War II. He'd been a major, so it wasn't the right guy, and he was out. And so the same day, by coincidence, I was talking to Glenn Dennis, and he was berating us for not finding his nurse yet. And I said, well, there's people with the same names. I said, just today I talked to a guy named Bob Slusher who had been in the Army Air Forces, but it's not the right guy. And Dennis says to me, oh, I know Bob Slusher. He lives over in Alamogordo. And it was the right guy. But the point is, I went and found Robert Slusher, and I got the phone number through directory assistance and called him. And it was the right guy. So there were a lot of people that we searched out. We looked for people who were assigned to the base. We talked to them about what was going on then. The children of the sheriff, Wilcox, I don't think any of them came forward. I think we went and searched them all out. And one of the keys we had was a fellow named Ralph Hike, who lived in Roswell. And he knew them, and he said to us one day, right after we'd begun the investigation, "Would you like to talk to the family of Sheriff Wilcox?" I said, "Well, yeah, of course." And so he said, it's Phyllis McGuire, it's Elizabeth Polk, and that sort of thing. So we sought those people out. So it's not that a lot of people came forward. It was we were searching them out. By the same token, Thomas Gonzalez, who was a low-ranking, I think he was a sergeant in E5, went to the International UFO Museum, actually the other museum when they had two museums. It was the one that John Price was hosting in his video store. Had gone in there and was talking to John Price about it, and Don Ecker happened to be there. And so Thomas Gonzalez sort of came forward and told his tale of what he had seen and how he'd been involved. So he sort of came forward, but we did sort of search him out as well. And of course, the first thing you do is look to see if his picture's in the yearbook, and it was, and we found other indications. There were other people whose names weren't in the yearbook, and I had a copy of the base telephone directory, which has the telephone numbers of the officers. And one of the guy's niece had said that her uncle had been involved and couldn't find him in the yearbook, but I went through the phone book and his name was in there too. So Walter Hott told me that 15 to 20% of the people assigned to the base in 1947 did not appear in the yearbook. So it's a great resource for looking for people because, here's their names, here's their pictures. It gives you a place to start, but not everybody was there or is in the yearbook. So to just reject it because the people came out of the woodwork after 1980 is again another bogus reason for ignoring the case.
Well, I wish you called in because there was another part where he mentioned about, I talked about the bodies, and then I said, well, first of all, why the Air Force in 1997, whenever it was, when they did that, whatever it was, the investigation on Roswell, they could have just said nothing about the bodies, so there were no bodies or anything like that, instead of saying that they were those crash tests or whatever they were, dummies, which are, and then I mentioned I said they didn't even have to mention that. Why did they mention that? And then also that they came out 5 years after, they weren't even produced until 5 years after Roswell. And his, the answer for everything, but the answer for that one was that it was called, I believe he said flashbulb memory, and that it's not accurate. People get the dates wrong of things. So
flashbulb memory refers to an event that you're involved in that is of extreme importance to you for whatever reason. And people have flashbulb memories about the Kennedy assassination.
Right.
One of the experiments done for that was a guy named Nesser, I think, at when the shuttle blew up in 1985. He took the students in his freshman psychology class and asked them to write down. He gave them 6 questions about what had happened. Where were you? How did you hear about it? These sorts of things. When they became seniors, he gave them the same questionnaire with an additional question: how accurate do you think your memories are? What he found was about 25% of them's memories were accurate, and about 25% of them's memories were completely off the wall. One girl said that she had been home when it happened. She had been at the college, at the university, had been there and heard about it on the radio. And her response was, well, that's how I remember. Well, fine, you remember it that way, but you're wrong. So 25% of the people with the flashbulb memories is accurate, 25% is not. The other 50% range on a continuum between really accurate and not very accurate. So that also is bogus. But here's the thing. The second report was done by McAndrew. It wasn't part of the original Air Force study, and he wanted to deal with the problem with the bodies. What he did was take information that we now know to be bogus and report it as if it was accurate, as if it was the truth. And so he based his conclusions on faulty information, which eliminates part of that reason as well. So, a lot of the reasons that we hear for rejecting Roswell simply are not true, not really accurate. They say, well, it was this highly classified balloon project known as Mogul, and it was so classified the guys there didn't even know the name of it. And what we found out was that, A, it really wasn't Project Mogul going on there. It was something called the New York University Constant Level Balloon Project, which ultimate goal was the Mogul spy balloons. But we find out that in the diary kept by the professor leading the experiments, Dr. Albert Crary, he mentions Mogul at least 3 times in his diary, so they clearly knew the name. The equipment being used was off the shelf common balloon equipment. One guy, in fact, on my blog was just complaining. Well, they didn't even have these Raywin radar reflectors in New Mexico. They weren't even doing it. And I found an article coincidentally in the Roswell newspaper on July 10th that talked about how the Albuquerque office of the Weather Bureau said, yeah, we've been launching these things for years. So a lot of the reasons are just flat out bogus. So let us say that for whatever reason we reject Mogul. I think we have very good reasons for rejecting Mogul, simply because almost nothing said about it turns out to be true. But even if we reject Mogul, that doesn't get us to the extraterrestrial. It just means this explanation doesn't work. And the anthropomorphic dumbings is absolutely ludicrous to even suggest that. And then to alibi, well, people's memories are wrong. Yeah, that's true. But, this does not account for the descriptions of the bodies that were given. They're not anthropomorphic. They're not humanoid. They're not human-looking bodies. I shouldn't say humanoid, but human-looking bodies. Given all the testimony that we have, so you can reject Roswell for a myriad of reasons, but most of those that Schirmer provided for you simply aren't accurate.
One of the things that I didn't really, we started right out talking about Roswell. I had no idea where we were going to, and I'm glad we are. I think it's fascinating, and I'm learning some things. And one of the questions I have for you, what do you suppose the 2 crash sites meant?
Well, actually, there's probably more than 2. There's probably 3. But it looks to me, if you look at the descriptions, it looks to me like you've got one of those deals where the thing hit the ground up near the Brazel Ranch, the Foster Ranch, skipped back up into the air. It scattered some debris at that point. It shed more debris at another point, and then impacted at the third point. The second point may have been some kind of an ejection pod, may have been some kind of a escape pod, and that was why it was not associated with the other 2 sites. But when we start, we've got very good evidence for the site up on the Foster Ranch. Something hit the ground there. Everybody agrees on that. When you get to the second site, the testimony becomes less robust. One of the things is you've got General Exxon, who talked about flying over. He said those 2 sites back in 1947, which kind of brings us to the idea there's 2 separate sites. I think D. Proctor took his mother to a site that was not the Brazel site, but 2 or 3 miles away, suggesting that something had happened there. And D. Proctor had been with Mac Brazel on the morning he found some of this stuff. So there's those sorts of testimonies that we have, but when you move away from the Foster Ranch, the testimonies aren't nearly as robust as some of them were. We've got Jesse Marcel talking about the Foster Ranch. You've got Cavett talking about the Foster Ranch, and whatever you say about it, he's at least talking about that place. And then when you move beyond that, you get some other problems. Louis Rickett, who was the NCOIC of the CIC, I just did that because in the military you're acronym happy. That means he was the top. The NCOIC means he was the non-commissioned officer in charge. He was the top NCO in the counterintelligence office. And according to his testimony, he was taken out to the site by his boss, which was Cavett, but they only drove like 45 miles or 45 minutes to get to the place. And when he got out there, he saw, I think, he talked about Easley being there and that sort of thing. So you've got Rickett talking about that. You've got a guy named Chester Barton who worked for Edwin Easley at the time, and Easley sent him out a couple of days later to see what was going on. Barton believed what it was the wreck of a B-29, but he said it didn't look like any of the wreckage that he'd ever seen before in a B-29 crash. He didn't see anything that looked like particularly like an airplane, but he was of the opinion that it was a B-29. Well, the Air Force eliminated that explanation for us by telling us there were no aircraft accidents in the area that would account for the debris. So we can point to the Air Force and say, well, the Air Force said this. And we couldn't find anything when we were looking either. We looked through a lot of records looking for some kind of an aviation accident or an experimental aircraft accident that would account for the debris, and we couldn't find anything either. So you've got a number of people who talk about getting out to that area and seeing this stuff, but you don't have the same kind of descriptions of the size, the distribution of the materials, and that sort of thing that you find out toward the Foster Ranch.
Mm-hmm. You said a minute ago that there is a myriad of reasons why you could reject Roswell. Those weren't some of them. And is that a personal opinion of yours,
yes,
or are you speaking in generality?
I'm speaking of my personal opinion.
Okay. Well, I'd like to hear your discounting of Roswell.
Well, one of the things that bothers me immensely is we can find no diary. People's personal diaries or journals that mention this thing at all that are dated from 1947. There's no letters to family members dated 1947 that mentions this. The only diary we've ever found was Ruth Barnett's diary, and she had been given one of those daily reminder books by an insurance company or a real estate company back in 1947, and she kept it religiously for the entire year of 1947. No mention of the crash over on the plains, no mention of Barney Barnett being involved in anything like this, no mention of anything that would give us a hint of what was going on. And I've talked to a lot of people. One of the people I found was a woman named Anna Wilmot, who had suggested that she and her husband had seen part of the crash as they were returning to Roswell and inadvertently got involved in this thing. And I said, well, do you have any letters or anything from that time? She said, no, we don't have anything. And that was one of the things that bothered me. If Shermer had said, well, you can find no documentation from the people involved that suggests they were involved in this thing back in 1947, that would be a valid point.
Now, what do you think about how people felt about the government? They were respected the government after World War II. We were in a different time, and they really listened to the government when they said, don't talk about it.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. There's no question that the relationship between the citizens and the government was one of well, I'm not sure the government respected the people, but certainly the people respected the government. And Bill Brazel told me that his father had told him that he had taken an oath he wouldn't talk about it, and he wasn't going to talk about it. Bill said his father was just like that. He might have known a lot of things, like who stole a calf, but he wouldn't tell anybody these things, and the government asked him not to talk about it, and he wasn't going to talk about it. So you've got that sort of thing, and you look at it from a military perspective. If you are exposed to classified materials as part of your job or just inadvertently, there are legal consequences for sharing that classified material with somebody else, which I don't know what it was in 1947, but I remember when I was first getting involved with the intelligence work, it was a $20,000 fine and 20 years in jail, which is an impressive threat.
Wow.
But it was, but we understood that you're not supposed to talk about this. If you do, there are consequences for it, whether they're military consequences to your career or criminal consequences for it. There are consequences for sharing this material with people. When you move into the civilian arena, one of the problems you run into is somebody like Glenn Dennis saying, well, they told me they'd be picking my bones out of the ground. I don't believe Glenn Dennis. I don't think he was telling the truth. When you get to Frankie Rowe, I think that they came to visit her and suggested that if she talked, her parents would be arrested. I think since that time, in 1947, she's come to believe that they told her that they would all be killed if they talked about it. But her original discussion was more to the idea they would end up in jail. Her parents would be taken away and put in jail. So there are those sorts of things going on that suggest the possibility of threats to people and that sort of thing, but keeping things quiet. And I think part of it is simply the military attitude. You're exposed to classified material. You're not allowed to share it. Pappy Henderson said when one of the articles appeared in one of the tabloid newspapers, he bought a copy, which surprised his wife, Sappho. She told me that he just never looked at that stuff. And he gave her the newspaper, which had a story about Roswell in it, and told her to read it, and then said, this story's true. I flew the bodies to right field. And he says, I suppose now that they're putting it in the newspaper, I can tell you about it. Technically, he was wrong. Doesn't matter what they put in the newspaper. He learned of the events through his exposure in the military, and it was still classified. It is still classified. He technically couldn't talk about it, but he just verified for her that the story was true. So you've got all those sorts of things going on.
Now, there's a question up, or sort of a question or a statement I'll get to in just a second, but one of the things that I had, talked to different people who don't think that Roswell happened, it said, well, why would the Army Air Force go as far as publicizing that they captured a disc? Why would they do that? And there's been some answers. People say, oh, because it was a spy balloon or something. And it's all, in my opinion, kind of ridiculous. But one of the things I've been thinking about lately is if there was some other excuse for them to put that in the papers and announce it on the radio and all that, they didn't have to do any of that. It was a small town. They didn't even have to say that anything was captured or found or anything at all. That was ridiculous. That there was no need for them to even post anything, is what I'm getting at.
I think what happened is that when Marcel and Cabot returned to the base, if you go with the descriptions that Marcel provided of the debris field, it was just metallic debris. There was nothing that led you to the extraterrestrial. So that when Cabot and Marcel went and told Blanchard what they had found, they didn't realize the significance of it. And I think Blanchard, well aware of the flying saucer stories going around, thought, well, we've got one. We're going to be able to tell you what it is here in a few minutes. And it's kind of reminiscent of the case from Circleville, Ohio, which I think took place over the July 4th weekend, where a farmer had found actually a Ray wind target in a weather balloon and thought that the Ray wind, which was covered with foil to reflect the radar signals better, but also in the daylight, the sun would reflect off and it'd be easier for them to track visually. He knew what it was immediately and knew some kind of weather device and showed it to the sheriff who knew, who gave it to the newspaper. And I think what happened was on July 8th, when Cabot and Marcel returned to Blanchard's office, and maybe had some pieces of the material which resembled common stuff. I mean, there were things about it that certainly made it uncommon. That he thought, well, we've got an answer, and he just said, well, we found one here in the Roswell area. It was only after they had announced that they found out that there was something else going on. There was something more important going on. So I think that all kind of plays into it. So they were premature in their press release, but they didn't really understand what they had at that time, and that kind of accounts for it. And that explains why within 3 hours the story was retracted. And it was retracted, well, the lower headquarters says we got a flying saucer, and the higher headquarters says, no, it's a weather balloon. Don't worry about it. They've made a mistake, and everybody goes away happy. But what they did do also is you have to remember that the key players are now out of contact with the media. You had Brazel, who's now being held at the base on July 8th. He's at the base. You've got Blanchard, who suddenly goes on leave on a Tuesday afternoon, which makes absolutely no sense to me. Why does somebody go on leave in the middle of the day, unless it's an emergency leave and you've got to get the guy out of here? But there's no indications that there was any kind of emergency that Blanchard had to deal with, family emergency or whatever. It makes no sense. Marcel, they asked for Marcel. Well, he's in Fort Worth. They can't talk to him, and there's General Ramey saying it's a weather balloon. So the story dies at that point. They managed to kill it off very quickly. But what is also interesting is a lot of the hoaxes and misidentifications of this nature that was made in July of 1947 appear in the Project Blue Book files. But as I say, there's no reference to Roswell, and if it's just a balloon, why not? I mean, if it's not that unimportant, why keep it out of Project Blue Book? That makes no sense to me. So I think that the whole idea of the press release is Blanchard jumped the gun because he and Marcel and Cavett didn't understand the significance of what they had.
Wow, interesting. We're on live with Kevin Randle. If you'd like to call in, it's 603-967-4030. You can Skype in at Marty Willis. That's MartyWillis. And also, Kevin, up on the message board, someone was asking about the journals and basically why would you assume that people had journals? But my question on that is, when you interviewed these people, did you ask them, did you keep a journal, and did you send letters to families during that time?
We asked for documentation, any documentation that you might have. And given people still keep journals today, not quite as readily. Well, actually they do, because they post everything on Facebook. Well, I went to the store today, big whoop, bought a shirt, thought it was fun. But I mean, going back into 1947, a lot of people kept journals, a lot of people kept diaries. And if you were involved with something like that, you would think that they might write it down in their private journal, which is never supposed to see the light of day. Or if they're involved, they might have sent a letter to a family member. Says, "Boy, you just don't know what happened today." So we looked for that sort of documentation, and we have been unable to find anything. The best thing we have at the moment is the Ramey memo. That's the photograph of General Ramey holding the piece of paper that was taken on July 8th, 1947. We know when it was taken. We know who took it. We know who's in the picture. And if we could read the document, it might, and I stress that, might give us a clue that would help us understand this whole thing. So we believed that people would keep journals, people would write letters. There would be some sort of documentation that we might blunder into. But we have been unable to find anything like that at all. As I say, the closest thing, well, and that's how the Barnett diary was found. We had asked Alice Knight, who was Barney and I can't remember. Oh, Ruth Barnett about diary, and she said no, they didn't keep anything. And going through a box of books that had been or materials left by her aunt and uncle, she found a diary. And so the first thing that I did was visit with her. And she said, well, you can take it with you as long as you return it. And I was on my way to Albuquerque, and I met with Stan Friedman and Don Schmidt there. Stan actually stood at the Xerox machine and made 3 copies, one for him, one for Don, one for me. And then on my way home, I returned the diary to Ruth Barnett, but there's nothing in the diary to suggest anything at all like that. We have an article written by Inez Wilcox, the sheriff's wife, called 4 Years in the County Jail, and it was an article about her experiences when she was the matron of the jail when her husband was the sheriff. And there's 2 paragraphs or one long paragraph that talks about this event. But the problem is it was clearly added after the original article was written. There's no date on it, which doesn't help us at all. And I learned that she died, I think, in 1989, so clearly she could have written it after the book came out and after the interest in Roswell kind of exploded. And I would think the interest may not have been nationally, might not have exploded nationally, but certainly in Roswell, if your town is mentioned for whatever reason, you're gonna note it. I remember in Titanic, for example, the guy walking on talking to whoever, and he talks about how Rose had moved to Cedar Rapids. Well, I live in Cedar Rapids, so of course I noticed that right away. The snub of Cedar Rapids wasn't very nice, but I noticed it. So your town shows up in that, you're going to notice it. So we don't know when that was written. I suspect it was written after 1980, but I do not know. If it was dated and said something like 1952, that would have been great. there was an interview with Lydia Schleppe, who was the teletype operator in the radio station, that actually appeared in a 1976 magazine. And again, Stan Friedman and B. Ann Slade were interviewing people about another sighting, and it was her son was involved with it, and she just mentioned that she had been putting the story on the air about the UFO, and the transmission was interrupted. So there's something that predates 1976, predates the interest in this that we've been able to find and locate that kind of helps us out. But the real point is we just really can't find anything that we can date prior to even 1978, when Jesse Marcel started talking about this, that would give us any solid clues. I mean, any documentation like that would be outstanding, but we just have not found anything like that, and I find that quite worrisome.
Yeah, I do get that, because, well, on any major event, you look at, like, for instance, Civil War letters, World War II letters, Vietnam letters, something major happens in someone's life and they're corresponding and talking about it, and they feel more free to talk about it when they're sending it away, like across the country or something like that, to a relative. And so, I mean, I've actually gone through these type of letters and read through them, for interest in what happened, trying to piece together some little inside story of history.
And if you say that, well, the military people were told not to talk about it, so they wouldn't be writing home to talk about the flying saucer, but you've got civilians involved as well. Starting with Mac Brazel, for example. There's a number of civilians who were involved in this as well, who were on the scene, and we don't have anything from them either.
Did Jesse Marcel ever talk about reading that memo that he had in his hand?
You mean Ramey?
Ramey.
Nobody ever talked to Ramey.
Okay, that was Ramey that had it. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, my mistake. Okay. Now, I did speak to Shermer about that memo, and said that there was a gentleman in San Francisco that's been working on basically deblurring it, like they did the Roswell slide placard, which we really can't talk about. I promised my listeners I wouldn't talk about it. but anyway,
what placard would that be?
So there was a guy that has been working on it for a long time, and one thing I mentioned to Shermer, I said, we may get better technology for doing this down the road. And he said, nope. Once something is like in that type of form, you'll never, it's something like on a copy machine, you'll never be able to figure it out. And do you agree with that? Do you think that can ever be figured out?
Absolutely not, and here's why. In April, some of the top forensic photographic experts in the world traveled to the University of Texas at Arlington to look at the negative. Using the best equipment available, made new scans of it, scans that are like, gigabytes in depth, hoping that we would be able to deblur it. Shermer is wrong that the technology he's wrong in what he said. We may fail in this latest effort to understand what the memo says. And in fact, one of the guys said, I wish the cameraman, which would be J.B. Johnson, had been a foot closer. But applying the best technology available, getting high-resolution scans, the best that can be gotten at this point, which are better than the scans that Stan got a number of years ago, off the original negative, may provide us with those clues. Unfortunately, this took place in April, and I'm thinking, about the time that the placard stuff came out. I don't want to say what that involved, but around that time, the beginning of May, I thought we would have an answer to what the memo said. And here we are in almost November, and we still have not been able to do anything. A lot of the data has been turned over to a wide variety of people, including those on the skeptical side, to see if we can, unlike hiding the information behind this veil of secrecy, we're attempting to provide it to the people who have a good chance of reading it. If we got a good answer, we would, of course, explain how that was done so that everybody could do the same thing and see if we were right. One of the problems we're dealing with is copyright issues, because it turns out that the copyright is not clean. We don't know according to the people at the University of Texas, they're not sure that the copyright transferred from the Star-Telegram to the University of Texas. So they're trying to work out the copyright issues, which, there's a problem we didn't need. But I think Shermer is wrong that we may be able to improve the quality of the negatives, because we're dealing with a negative and not a digital image. We're not dealing with something off a copy machine. We're dealing with the original negative. And so there would be information on that original negative that would not necessarily show up in prints, would not necessarily show up in copy negatives, because in that environment, each time you make when you make a print, you've lost some of the quality from the negative. So we're dealing with the original negative that was made in 1947. It's not 35 millimeter film. It's not this crap. I think it's a 4x5 negative from high quality camera. So it's the best film available and the best camera available at the time. We may fail in our attempt, but we have not failed yet, and we may be able to determine something. It seems to me that the Ramey memo could be. Johnson said that he brought the document in with him and handed it to Ramey, which, of course, negates the importance of it. He later retracted that and said, no, that's not true. I picked it up off his desk. Well, if that's true, it may be some kind of a press release. It may be some kind of a preliminary document. It may be some kind of talking points that doesn't necessarily provide us with any proper information. There seems to be a signature block at the bottom of this thing, 5 letters or 6 letters, I think. If that can be blurred, if that can be seen, if that can be read with any kind of consensus, that might provide us a clue as to where to go next. So we're looking at all of that stuff, and we're looking for clues that may give us something, some information that may get us somewhere. It may be we end up reading the thing and it really provides us with nothing that we didn't already know, and provides us with no hints of where things are going. But I think Shermer just making a blanket statement, absolutely not, you can't do anything. I'm often astonished that skeptics and scientists would say things like that, especially with all the pronouncements they've made over the years that turned out to be wrong. Like, when they caught the first coelacanth in 1938, they said, it can't possibly be a coelacanth because these things went extinct 75 million years ago. And when they caught the second one, they said, whoops. Yeah. and we've got all kind. And now there's two locations where coelacanths breed, but fishermen don't like them because they don't taste very good, and they're at very deep portions of the ocean, so they're very, very difficult to catch. But I mean, we've got a lot of stuff like that where pronouncements were made by the scientific community about something being absolutely impossible, and it turns out not to be so impossible after all. So it's kind of a surprising statement. But he might be right that we cannot improve upon what we have. It may not work, but we're using the best quality equipment. The guy spent a week in Fort Worth gathering data and using all kinds of different techniques in attempts to get the best quality scans from it. Had full cooperation with the University of Texas at Arlington, helping out using one of those digital microscopes on a camera on a microscope. All kinds of things in a hope of improving what we can see in the photograph, and maybe understand it a little bit better. But in the end, Shermer might be right that we've taken it as far as we're ever going to be able to take it. But we're applying the best technology today that we have in an attempt to read it.
Right. Now, we're going to take a break here in just 1 second here, but I wanted to find out, do you happen to know if there was, a photographer usually takes more than one image. Was there ever any talk about a possible secondary or even multiple images of this?
He took 6 pictures. He took 2 of Ramey and DeBose, 2 of Marcel. And there is another picture with Ramey holding the document, but the way he's holding it, the angle of it, there's really nothing readable on it. But there is a second image.
Wow. Okay. All right, so we'll be right back. So we are going to talk in the second hour about Kevin's book. I thought we were going to get to it in this hour, but it just slipped away. And that book is called The UFO Dossier, and 100 Years of Government Secrets, Conspiracies, and Cover Ups. So hang in there for the quick music break, and we'll be right back. Kevin, I wanted to get right into your book, but, there's a couple of questions up on the message board, and one of them is someone wondered if you ever interviewed any of Ramey's relatives.
Yes. I talked to Ramey's wife. She lived in Denton, Texas, and it turned out she had talked about during World War II, going to dances at Fort Walters, Texas, and it turned out, of course, I'd been at Fort Walters, Texas, going through the Army's helicopter school. So we had that sort of connection. She, I believe, was his second wife, and she didn't know anything about it, and said that we should try to talk to his son. And we were unable to get him to talk to us about it. Same thing with Blanchard's family. We attempted to make contact with members of Blanchard's family and didn't get a whole lot of information from them either. Blanchard being the commander of the 509th Bomb Group in Roswell at the time. So yeah, we tried and as the investigation continued, I became less and less inclined to search out family members, because now you're removed at least once from what the person saw, and there's all kinds of opportunities for the family to misunderstood what he said. And I say he simply because the majority of the people in Roswell, members of the military at the time in 1947, would have been male, but there was very there's all kinds of opportunities to misunderstand and misinterpret what they said, and you can't get back to the original source to learn anything more about it. So, yeah, we tried to talk to members of the family. I think Don Schmidt and Tom Carey took that to a new level. I mean, they actively searched out people like that and when they couldn't find the original source. But I just didn't find that being of a great deal of use. I mean, it gave us clues and it provided us avenues to explore, but in the end, you're talking to somebody who wasn't there and just heard the tales. So,
I get that.
Yeah, so that's kind of where we were on that.
Did you sort of, I don't want to say walk away from Roswell, but you don't focus on Roswell at this point, and I just wanted to know what if you wouldn't mind sharing the reason for the change, because I know you're really involved and not so much at this point.
Well, one of the reasons was my National Guard unit got called to active duty, and I ended up in Iraq. So that kind of put the kibosh on things. And until I retired in 2009, it seemed that there was a lot of things going on. A lot of people don't understand, but the reserve component, which is the National Guard and the Army Reserve, had been integrated into what they think of as a total force concept, so that they were being used for more active duty missions. When I was in the Air Force Reserve, we had an ongoing mission for 6 weeks. We supplied the aircraft that flew out of, I think, Howard Air Force Base in the Canal Zone, running missions into South America and that sort of thing. And by missions, I mean just ferrying things around and supporting other installations. Nothing nefarious. And so you get a lot of that going on. But as we move toward the end of the 20th century, we were learning that a lot of the witnesses were not as candid as they could have been. I mean, they're embellishing their tales. They're making stuff up, and it became very disheartening to listen to some witnesses denigrate other witnesses simply because they viewed it as sort of a competition, that if you talk to this guy, you won't be talking to me, and so you can't talk to this guy because he doesn't know what he's talking about. And that became very tiresome in the end. But as I said, as we moved after 9/11 and that sort of thing, I got more involved with the National Guard and what our units were doing, and that sort of thing. When we had the floods in Iowa in 2008, for example, and I think virtually the entire Iowa National Guard, which wasn't deployed at the time, was working on flood recovery because it was, Cedar Rapids, Iowa was basically cut off from the rest of the state because of the rising rivers, and there was a lot of that going on. At one point in, I think, 2003, the vast majority of the Iowa National Guard was deployed to Iraq. There wasn't that many National Guardsmen left in the state of Iowa. Per capita, we had the highest number of people deployed. So that kind of got in the way. But now, in 2011, Tom Carey approached me to write the ultimate Roswell book, and we were going to treat it as kind of a cold case. And so I've been reviewing a lot of the evidence, a lot of the transcripts of witness testimony and things like that, and it's we found, I don't trust Glenn Dennis's testimony anymore. I know Don and Tom sort of do. They make sort of a case to listen to what he has to say, but a lot of these people have proven not to be reliable. I was on a TV program after the Stan Friedman, and the host asked about the number of people who'd seen the bodies, and I knew of 8 people who'd seen the bodies and talked about that at that time. And now I don't believe any of them were actually involved. Really? So we run into that. Frank Kaufman seemed to have a lot of good inside information, and Walter Hott vouched for him. Said, "Yeah, Frank tells you this, it's golden." Well, it turns out Frank isn't golden. Frank was making it up. So, that's those sorts of things are very disturbing when you're looking at the totality of the Roswell case. Everybody agrees something happened. Something fell at Roswell. But the problem is the evidence that we would like to see just hasn't materialized. I mean, we have looked for it very, very... I got involved in this in 1989, and we've looked very, very hard for that, and a lot of the people that we interviewed are no longer around to be re-interviewed. But we have the tapes. We have audio and video tapes of them. But there are questions that I would like to ask today that were not relevant back in 1990, 1991. Edwin Easley would be a wonderful source of information. I talked to him from the Center for UFO Studies one day. We were there to kind of brief the board on what we had found, and by we I mean Don Schmidt and I. And they were having a board meeting, and Mark Rodiger, the scientific director, said to me, "Well, you got a phone here. If you need to make some phone calls to witnesses or whatnot, go right ahead." So I called Edwin Easley, but I don't have my recording equipment, so we're just chatting, and I'm making notes about this, and learned that Basil had been held in the guest house on the base, as opposed, he said he was in jail. He was actually held in the guest house, but if the door's locked, he's not allowed to leave. It's basically jail. And I asked him at one point, I said, "Well, do you think we're following the right path?" And he said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, we think it was extraterrestrial." And he said, "Well, let me put it this way, it's not the wrong path." And I didn't record it because I didn't have recording equipment. I fully expected to see him again. And a couple of months later, Mark Rodiger, interviewing him again, a couple of months later, Mark Rodiger says, "Well, I've got to be down in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Can you arrange a meeting with Easley?" And I thought, great. Another person talking to this guy getting the same kind of information I got would be wonderful. And he could record the conversation and all that sort of thing. So I tried to set it up, and turned out Easley was terminally ill with cancer. And of course, at that point, I got a nice letter from one of his daughters, and our phone calls had scared the mother to death. She thought that he had gotten into some kind of trouble, and there was going to be all kinds of trouble about his pension and his history, his career in the Air Force. And so I wrote back and said, we didn't understand that he was ill. We didn't mean to intrude, and please forgive us, and we won't bother you anymore about this. But, I mean, here was an opportunity to gather some information, and the events kind of interceded so that we couldn't get the quality of the information we wanted. I know what Easley said to me, but when you get right down to it, can I prove it? Absolutely not.
Right.
And that's the sad thing, because I'd like to be able to push a button on the tape and have Edwin Easley say to me, yeah, you're not following the wrong path. So,
well, would you consider, you told us basically, and I know we have to move on to your book, because I could talk a number of hours on this subject, but
I can't.
When you said earlier, the reasons for discounting Roswell, would you say that is one of the big things for saying that it possibly did happen and could be extraterrestrial?
My discussion with Easley is absolutely one of the big things, and the military response seems all out of proportion. If you look at Project Mogul, which is they supposedly were trying to protect Mogul, but you've got a newspaper article that appeared, I think, on July 10th in the Alamogordo News, and there are pictures of a Mogul balloon launch. That's how classified it was. There's photographs in the newspaper. In fact, Charles Moore, who was one of the guys on Project Mogul, in looking at the pictures, he pointed to the ladder in one of the pictures, and he said, "Oh yeah, that's a ladder I bought with petty cash." So clearly, they're launching a balloon, saying, "Well, here's an explanation for the flying discs." They didn't say Project Mogul, but they said it was the balloon launches out of Alamogordo. So that's kind of telling you what you needed to know there. And so you look at the response by the military, and it seems out of proportion. And then you read, like I said before, in the newspapers on the 9th, the next day, that the Army and Navy are moving to suppress the stories. And you have to ask why. What do they care? What happened overnight that they suddenly wanted to stop the speculation about what flying saucers were? There's something took place. You've got all kinds of stories up to that point where military spokesmen, scientists, government officials are saying this is what it is, this is what it isn't. The Navy says it doesn't belong to us, and all of that kind of stuff going on. And then on the 9th, they just don't want to talk about it anymore. So you have to ask what happened. We have found nothing that you could look at. No experiments in progress at the time. No experimental aircraft being flown at the time. That the technology wouldn't be superseded by today's technology, so there's no point in keeping it secret any longer.
Right.
That sort of thing going on. We found absolutely nothing like that. The Air Force found nothing like that, other than this cockamamie Project Mogul explanation, which makes no sense when you look at the whole thing. And an interesting point, and Colonel Weaver, who was one of the authors of the big, thick document, said that they had put everything they found in the report so that we could all see exactly what it was. And that was how, going through the report, I found Project Mogul's name in there. So you had this thing, well, Project Mogul was so secret they didn't even know the name of it. The answer is, well, yeah, they did, because they're talking about Project. I think it's December 8th, 1946. In the notes, it says the Mogul equipment has arrived. So it's pretty clear like that. So it's that sort of thing going on that you look at, and you have to say, well, we do not have a terrestrial explanation for it, which does not mean it was extraterrestrial in nature. It just means we don't have a terrestrial explanation for it. You need something else to get you to the extraterrestrial. And that's where Easley's information kind of comes in, because it was so subtle in the way we recovered it. And you've got other guys talking about, I was out there, I picked up the bodies, I did this, I did that, and I'm thinking here specifically of Frank Kaufman, and it turns out that he wasn't involved. He was a civilian employee at the base working in personnel at the time. There'd be no reason to involve him in this. He talked about, and he showed his documents. His personnel documents showed that he was involved in intelligence, that he'd been a master sergeant. And eventually, I didn't know people actually doctored those things, but after reading Stolen Valor, I realized they doctored them all the time.
Isn't that something?
And we got the documents from St. Louis, and he turned out to have been a staff sergeant, and his training had all been in personnel. He had no intelligence background. There was no reason to involve this guy. And we found all kinds of things like that. So, that sort of goes away, and that hurts the case and everything else. But, the people who had the best stories turned out to be the least credible, I should say, least credible of some of the witnesses. Easley was a very good witness. Patrick Saunders, who was the base adjutant, there was on the flyleaf of the book, and I forget which one it was, UFO Crash at Roswell or Truth About, I forget which one. There's a flyleaf, and it says damage control, and it talks about all the things they did to kind of hide this. And Saunders sent copies of the book to various friends and family, and he wrote on the flyleaf, "This is the truth, and I never told anybody anything." I mean, here's a statement by the guy who was there. It gains him nothing. He gets no publicity for it. He gets no notoriety for it. He's just telling family members what it is, and I happened to get a copy of it because I was in communication with some of the family members, which gets back to the question, did you ever talk to Rainey's family? But I mean, here's an interesting little tidbit that really doesn't prove it's alien or extraterrestrial, but it suggests there's some kind of a mysterious event that took place.
Right. And one of the things you mentioned, and this is totally the last thing I'm going to say about Roswell, is, had on the for tonight. Yeah. The Army, Air Force, the Air Force changed their story 4 times. Someone posted that on the chat room, which I believe is accurate. They
said originally they had a flying saucer. Didn't really explain what it was, but they had a flying saucer. In July of 1947, didn't necessarily mean an extraterrestrial spacecraft, although that was one of the possibilities. Then they said, no, it was a weather balloon. And then they said in 1994, well, we lied about it being a weather balloon. It was a weather balloon. So
Project Mogul.
Yeah. Project Mogul.
Yeah.
Which is basically weather balloons and radar reflectors. So they changed the story at least 3 times, and possibly 4, but it's clear. Oh, and then they admitted in 1994, well, we lied about it in 1947. Yeah, we got that. So it's that sort of thing going on. So you've got those sorts of problems as well. Doesn't get you necessarily to the extraterrestrial, but you've got to wonder, what are they hiding today that happened that long ago? We're certainly not going to give the Soviets any clue into our espionage operations because the Soviets don't exist anymore. And I don't think we ever deployed Mogul to spy on the Soviets because by the time they got the problems with the constant level balloons worked out, they had the U-2, which is a much better way of spying on somebody than a balloon. Experimental aircraft, some kind of quantum leap in our understanding of aeronautics. The SR-71 comes to mind, but we know about the SR-71. The technology that's being used today is so far superior to that of 1947. We'd look like the alien visitors if we were able to take our technology back to 1947.
Sure. All right. Well, let's shift gears and talk about this great book that you've written, and I'm in the middle of it. Unfortunately, I was hoping to read it by the time the show came, but I'm a slow reader, but I will read it, and it's really interesting. Can you tell the listening audience about the book and the genesis for you writing it?
I began with a book called The Government UFO Files, which dealt basically with what was going on in the United States and how there was, how we got to this point we are today in the discussion of flying saucers and alien spacecraft. This book, the UFO Dossier, is sort of an outgrowth of that, and rather than just looking at the United States material, look at it on a worldwide perspective. How has this been kept a secret? The United States certainly couldn't force other governments, especially those who are not our allies, into keeping secrets of UFOs if they didn't want to. And this book kind of explores some of that, kind of explores what some of the other countries have done in their UFO investigations. One of the things that I found interesting was the Australians began an investigation of UFOs in the 1950s, and it was based on one of their scientists reading Kehoe's book about what was going on here and all of that stuff. So the Royal Australian Air Force naturally asked the U.S. Air Force what was going on. And the U.S. Air Force says, oh, you can't believe this Kehoe guy. He's making stuff up. It's not true. You just ignore that stuff. And the Australian Air Force, of course, accepted that. When we now look at it from our perspective of 2015, 50 years later, we realized that Kehoe's sources were good, and Kehoe wasn't making it up, that a lot of the things he said were absolutely true. So the U.S. Air Force was able to thwart the Australian investigation simply by belittling and smearing the name of Don Kehoe and what he was doing. And that kind of the thing. Scientists don't want to lose their credibility by talking about something as ridiculous as flying saucers, for crying out loud, unless they happen to be a scientist of the caliber of, say, J. Allen Hynek, whom I mentioned specifically because I actually had an opportunity to interview him about flying saucers. And he wasn't worried about what his colleagues would think about him because he's J. Allen Hynek. Not Hynek, I'm sorry, James A. Van Allen. I should say James A. Van Allen because that's even more impressive. Van Allen taught at the University of Iowa, and I'd attended the University of Iowa. And at the University of Iowa, they're not called the Van Allen radiation belts. They're called just the radiation belts. And I had a friend, Bob Cornett, and we were writing magazine articles, and he said, well, we could interview Van Allen. And he says, I know Van Allen. I'm thinking, yeah, sure you do. My foot, you know Van Allen. But we were in the physics building, and I don't remember why we were in there. There were classes other than physics and astronomy classes taught there. And we were riding on the elevator, and the doors open, and Van Allen gets on. And he looks down and he says, hi, Bob. And Bob Cornett says, hi, Van. And I'm realizing he actually does know Van Allen. And Bob set up an interview, and I had an opportunity to sit down with Van Allen for about an hour talking about Tunguska, which is in the book. We talk about what he thought of the Tunguska explosion, and we talked about other things. It's kind of funny now, but I said something about the evidence leading to UFOs, and he said, well, if you're in the middle of Wyoming and you hear the thunder of hooves, you don't expect zebra. And not long ago, there was a story from Wyoming where a pet zebra had gotten loose and was running around Wyoming. And I'm thinking, you're hearing the thunder of hoofs, and you don't expect zebra, but by God, there is one.
If only he knew that.
Yes. Unfortunately, Van Allen died before I could call him up and say, sometimes in Wyoming there are these zebras. But he provided some interesting information about a physicist and astronomer's perspective on Tunguska that I found very, very interesting, and some of the scientific investigations that got on there. But it's also, I also talk in the book about some of the Soviet investigations, the Russian investigations of what was going on, and how there is still a persistence of belief in Russia that this thing was not an asteroid, was not a comet. It was an extraterrestrial event. We're now arguing about the nature of the extraterrestrial event, but it may have been some kind of a spacecraft that exploded. And Van Allen had told me that getting what he called a high-level explosion, a high-grade explosion, is a difficult thing to do. That if a power plant, an atomic power plant, would melt down, it's kind of a low-grade fizzle you get out. It spreads radiation all over the place, but it doesn't blow up. And so the fact that they would have a propulsion plant in a UFO that would explode on a high level like that, he found surprising. But we discussed it at length, and so some of that comes out in the book. But I look at it from the point of view of not only what Van Allen told me, but what some of the Soviet scientists who have studied this thing as well were saying about what the event was. So I personally think it probably was an asteroid, not unlike the event that took place a couple of years ago over the Soviet Union. But there is a body of evidence to suggest it was something alien, as some kind of a spacecraft.
Now, was there someone posts up on the message board? Was there radioactivity there?
When I talked about it with Van Allen, I believe there was I think it was cesium-138 was found in the 1960s when they had done some of the research in the area. And I mentioned that to Van Allen, and he said that that was an interesting finding, but in the 1960s, in the snowfalls in Iowa City, because that was where the University of Iowa is, they would find cesium-138 in the snowfalls because of all the atomic testing that had been going on in the atmosphere. So, by the time we get to the 1960s, we're into a sort of a contaminated environment in that respect. So, yeah, there was radiation found. Is it indicative of some kind of a spacecraft explosion? Given the timing, we would need to look at the specific levels to give us an idea. But there is a possibility of contamination. So, yeah, there was radiation found, but it may have been contamination from our atomic testing. When I say ours, I don't mean just the United States, but the Soviets and the British and the French, I think, were the ones testing in that time frame.
How about that? Hang on just one second. I'm trying to read I'm sorry. I was trying to read a message that went by on the message board. Okay. So what are, in this book, I know you start out early, in early UFOs, and the Foo Fighters and all that. The Foo Fighters are, and then the ghost rockets, that's another intriguing one. And I've spoke with Klaus Svahn over in Sweden about the ghost rockets.
Helpful to me as well. He read the chapter. Well, the whole long chapter is actually in the government UFO files, and he read that for me to make sure I hadn't gotten anything wrong, and provided some of the photographs for the chapter as well. So yes, he's very helpful.
Yes, yeah. And so, the Foo Fighter thing, what is your thoughts about those? I mean, I know you mentioned that it's possible that it could be a natural phenomenon, or I believe you wrote something like that as a comment. I think the possibility that a lot of it was kind of a natural phenomenon that was poorly understood. But if you take a look at the work Keith Chester has done in his book Strange Company, and his work is very valuable. What he didn't realize, the most valuable point, at least for me, was he mentioned a fellow named Colonel Howard McCoy, who was involved in the investigation of the Foo Fighters. And they're looking into this thing, and the Foo Fighters are frightening to the Allies because it suggests a technology that is superior to ours, and if it's deployed by our enemies, it could change the nature of the air war in all theaters, not just in Europe, but they were seen in all theaters of the war during World War II. Mm-hmm. And McCoy's involved in this. The priority to understand what it was disappeared with the end of the war, because obviously we don't need to worry about the Nazis or the Japanese acquiring this technology and using it against us. But there are any number of sightings that involve structured craft. There are sightings where our guys fired upon the Foo Fighters, and they saw either the bullets disappear, and I'm thinking tracers here as opposed to something else, or disappeared or bounce off the craft. So you're talking about a structured craft. So you've got sightings of not only the blobs of light, which is what most people think about for the Foo Fighters, and I think that probably is more toward a natural phenomenon than it is alien visitation. But when you start talking about structured craft and some of the response to our firing upon them, then you see something different there. And as I said, McCoy is involved in this. And when you move to the ghost rockets in 1946 in Sweden, there again you've got something going on that's not explainable. I think the conclusion drawn in 46 and 47 by the Scandinavians was that it was some kind of Russian attempt to intimidate the Swedish. But now with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you realize, well, that's not true. But one of the people involved in investigating that was Howard McCoy. So you got McCoy involved with the Foo Fighters, you got McCoy involved with the Swedish ghost rockets. And then when we move into 1946, you find, I think it was Twining, gave McCoy orders to set up an unofficial UFO investigation, unofficial investigation in December of 1946. In other words, six months before Arnold. So apparently the U.S. Army Air Force, as it was called at the time, later the Air Force, is investigating these aerial phenomenon prior to Arnold. And once the Arnold sighting takes place, well, then the unofficial investigation becomes more of an official investigation. And then Twining writes his letter in September of 1947 that says, these are something real, not visionary or fictitious. But I'm paraphrasing there, not quoting exactly. But the guy who actually drafted the letter was Howard McCoy. Really?
So you've got McCoy involved in the Foo Fighters, in the Ghost Rockets, in an unofficial investigation, and drafting the letter that sets up Project Sign, later evolves into Blue Book. So you've got one guy who knows all of this stuff being involved in it. So you say, well, where's his files? According to Winnie Connors and, I can't remember the other guy's name, who did an investigation of a lot of this stuff, a lot of those files are now under the golf course at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. In other words, they buried the files. They did not move from McCoy's unofficial investigation into the official investigation. Very, very little of that material got communicated up the chain of command, or chain into the official project. So that's one of the things that gets us from the Foo Fighters into the modern era. That's why I think the modern era of UFO research began not with the Arnold sighting in 1947, but began with the Foo Fighters during World War II.
I want to talk just a brief minute, though, about the Arnold sighting, Kenneth Arnold. Why do you suppose his story is like such an iconic story, and how could it have gone so viral back in the day?
Well, I think that's it. It went viral, and I think we were moving into what's known as the silly season in newspaper reporting, which means it's the summer and there's not a lot of stuff going on, and we're looking for anything to attract our attention. And I think that's what it was. There had been sightings prior to that, but it didn't get communicated to the press, or if the press mentioned anything about it, it really didn't go anywhere. And Arnold's sighting kind of sparked an interest in this, and then you got people outside looking up and said, yeah, there's one, that kind of thing. And so I think Arnold's sighting just hit at the right time, in the right place, with the right information. And it went viral. And you think of, and I hesitate to mention this, I was watching a thing on cable this morning about Scream, the sort of spoof on the slasher movies. And they were saying, nobody thought it would do anything. It was made for a dime, made over $100 million, but made cheap, and nobody thought it would do anything, and it just sort of caught on, and it was the right cast, at the right time, with the right script, and it just worked right. And I think that's the thing with the Arnold sighting. It was just sort of Ray Palmer, who was an editor of a science fiction magazine, got caught up in this shaver mystery, and this is the guy with the story of the D-Rose and the malevolent robots living in the center of the earth and all of this stuff flying in these kind of craft. And suddenly there's the Arnold sighting, and Palmer's interested in it because it validates his belief that the shaver mystery is true. And so he's now glommed onto this. And you get to the Maury Island story, and one of the guys had actually written a letter to Palmer about the shaver mystery, saying it was all true back in 1946 before Arnold. But then Arnold shows up with the story, and Palmer writes to him and says, has heard about this Maury Island thing in Washington. Says, can you look into this for me? And so he gets involved in that as well. So I think it's just, it's one of those deals. Arnold was in the right place at the right time with the right story, and everybody was ready for it. And if it hadn't been Arnold, it probably would have been something else that sent the mystery into the consciousness of the United States at the time. And you've got to remember, in 1946, all of this sort of thing was going on in Sweden, in Scandinavia, and nobody really cared because it's going on in Europe. And the Foo Fighters, well, that was something going on in World War II. We're beyond that. So it's now it's Arnold in the United States, and our press is interested. And as a sort of an aside, one of my extra duties in Iraq, I was a public affairs officer, and the bad guys blew up the UN building. And so I engineered it to take a trip down there, and I'm thinking I can do a press release about this. So I go down to the blown up building, and of course I'm way through. I'm in a convoy with another truck, and there's like 8 of us there, and we're way through because we're in Humvees, we're in uniform. I go up and I'm talking to the guards, and they're telling me everything I want to know because I'm there in my captain's clothes, and it says U.S. Army on my shirt, so they're figuring I did. So I've got this story, this inside story. I've got interviews of the guys who were there when it exploded. I've got interviews of what happened, and I write this story up and I send it to the local newspaper, and it doesn't appear, and it doesn't appear, and it doesn't appear. And I finally, I called my wife and said, "You call the editor and find out what's going on." And she called him, and then she emailed me back. She couldn't get off the phone fast enough, because here's an exclusive story with exclusive pictures of this national story of the UN, and the local reporter that we were given the information to figured, well, there's no Iowa people involved in it, so it's not of interest to the Iowa audience. It's a national story, you twit. And of course, the managing editor got the story up immediately because of it. But I mean, that's the sort of thing that you put up with. You just don't know what's going to go viral. You don't know what's going to hit. Mm-hmm. You don't know what's going to be important. And then you got some dummy sitting at the newspaper. Everybody else is talking about this story. You've got an exclusive. Nobody else talked to the guards who were on duty when the thing blew up, because they're, Spec 4, Spec 5, E5s. Basic NCOs, enlisted guys. They're telling me everything I want to know, because I'm a captain. And I'm right there, and I'm taking my notes and writing everything down. And I put together a story, and the local newspaper just kind of ignored it. They finally got it up a couple of days later, but they have the exclusive story. And the same thing, we didn't have the problem when Hussein was captured, because I sent the story in, and they had the right editor on it, and what our reaction was, because we were right there when it happened. Our guys were into Tikrit. Part of our battalion was into Tikrit. And so we knew something was going on, because all communication was cut off with them, and we couldn't get a hold of them. We were kind of worried about that, and then the ambassador announces we got Hussein. But the point simply is it went viral because it was in the right place at the right time.
Now, Maury Island, I heard a rumor that has been debunked. Did you hear anything about that?
Maury Island's a hoax.
Okay.
How's that for debunking? It was a hoax from the word go.
All right. So I want to hear about this, because it's been written about a million times. It's been in a bunch of movies, documentaries.
Doesn't make it true.
All right. So tell me about it. What?
Oh, good God. And I go into length in one of my books about it, too, and I can't remember which one. Anyway, what it is on June 21st, I think it was, these guys are out on Puget Sound, around Maury Island, which is in Puget Sound, Washington State, and they see 6 donut-shaped UFOs with a hole in the middle and everything. And one of them is apparently in trouble, and it flies over their boat and is dropping debris, and it injures the guy's son and kills their dog, and lands on Maury Island.
I didn't think it landed. I thought the other objects came around and kind of rescued it, and then it took off.
I think it landed, and the other objects came around, and then it took off. I think that's the story, because there was material supposedly found on Maury Island, and so these guys alert Ray Palmer about this story, because now we've got Arnold going on, and there's a lot of talk about flying saucers, and the guys write to Ray Palmer and said, "This is what happened to us." So Palmer gets Arnold involved, and Arnold's going to investigate. And Arnold's in his hotel room, wherever the hell it is in Washington State, and he's talking to guys, Chrisman and I can't remember the other guy's name for some reason.
The ones that flew and crashed?
With the guys on the boat, the harbor patrol.
Oh, okay.
Chrisman and some other guy whose name escapes me at the moment. And so they're giving the story to Arnold. And Arnold realizes he's just out of his depth. He doesn't know what's going on, and he calls E.J. Edwards, Captain Edwards, who Edward J. Smith, E.J. Smith. And I remember the name because that was the captain of the Titanic, by the way. But he's a United Airlines pilot who'd seen a bunch of flying discs by his United Airlines airplane on the July 4th weekend. And Arnold and he got to be pals, so Arnold brings him in to help him out because he doesn't know what he's doing. And while they're doing all of this, the stories are appearing in the newspaper about what's going on in the hotel room. And Arnold can't understand how the newspaper reporters are getting this information. Well, it turns out Chrisman's telling them. So there's no big secret. But Smith and Arnold tear apart the room looking for hidden microphones and all of this stuff. So Arnold calls his pal Davidson, Lieutenant Davidson, who is an intelligence officer, Fourth Army in California. And Davidson and Brown, Captain Brown, fly up in a B-25 to interview the harbor patrolman and Arnold and get all this information from Arnold about this. And they get there and they're listening to the story, and Brown and Davidson realize this thing's a hoax, and they want to get out as quickly as they can, but they don't want to embarrass Arnold because, Arnold's a nice guy and he's just caught up in this and he doesn't understand. And they palm off this debris with him. On the way back to Fourth Army headquarters, one of the engines of the B-25 catches fire, and two guys manage to bail out, two passengers, but neither Davidson or Brown get out, and the airplane crashes and they're killed, which is really tragic. And there's talk about how the airplane was shot down and it was full of bullet holes and all this stuff to prevent this debris from getting to Fourth Army headquarters. And I'm thinking, well, yeah, but these guys got like a ton of it. So shooting down an airplane is not going to do you any good. But so that's the story. But I think it's Chrisman had written a letter to Arnold in 1946 about the Shaver mystery. And I think maybe John Keel who found the letter, but it was published in the Amazing Stories. So you've got Chrisman making contact with Palmer prior to the Maury Island thing. Then you've got him involved in this UFO sighting. Well, it turns out that the son of the son who was injured by had his arm broken by the flying saucer debris. There's no record of that. Nobody could find any record of that. And I forget who. A guy lives in Oregon. Oh, good Lord. Used to write a column for UFO magazine. Did a long involved piece about Maury Island, by the way, 3-part piece on it. And his name escapes me all of a sudden too, which is unfortunately a problem of old age. People's names drop out of your head.
Well, that's okay. Yeah.
But he they had explored this. They couldn't find a record of the son. He actually interviews the son. He says that never happened. My dad made this whole thing up.
It's funny. It's like sometimes like a myth like this can become reality in a way because so many people are into the story and all that. And I'm kind of embarrassed being a host of a show that I didn't realize that was a hoax.
But you're absolutely right. A lot of people, unfortunately, don't do the primary research necessary. If I'm going to write a book about UFOs, a lot of time, well, not me personally, but a lot of the writers on UFO stuff, they just pull a bunch of books out and they rewrite all these stories with their own take on it. They don't bother to try to get to the primary sources so they can learn exactly what happened. So you get the story repeated and repeated and repeated. And
you don't follow the footnotes or the dead end.
I
read that in your book just now.
Well, no, I do a thing on my blog as well, calling "Chasing Footnotes," where I try to chase them to the end. But the best story is I remember reading this in any number of UFO books about this metal vessel. I always thought of it as a gravy boat, but it's more bell-like shaped. It was supposedly blown out of a solid rock in a quarry in Massachusetts in the 1850s. And everybody says, well, it was in Scientific American, so you can see about this story. But I don't think anybody ever went to the Scientific American and looked. Well, the University of Iowa had the bound periodical section that went, and they had all the issues of the Scientific American. So I went back and looked it up and found the story. And it turns out the story really isn't about the metal vessel. That's not the important part. The important part of the story is it was apparently made by a guy named Tubal-Cain. And if you had any Masonic background, you'd realize that Tubal-Cain is very important in Masonic myth. So now you have to wonder, is this story some way of contacting the Masons as opposed to really be about this metal vessel? And it turns out the bell shape, and there's I think there's a picture of it on the internet if you look it up. But it's more like a bell. And they're now talking about how it wasn't in the solid rock, but it was actually in the earth, the dirt, soil. Soil was the word I was looking for. Soil on top of this part of the quarry. So when it was blown out, they find the metal vessel. It's mixed in with the granite. And they think, well, it came out of the solid rock, but probably it came out of the soil on top of the granite. But I chased it down to its origins because I was interested in see what it said.
I think it's very important to do that, and I'm glad that there's people like you out there that do that. We have only about 5 minutes left, Kevin, and there was some questions up and that aren't going to really dovetail your book too much. So I'm going to
mention the name UFO Dossier. Now we can go to the questions.
Okay. And also your blog spot. What is the name of your blog spot? Because that's a very active one, by the way.
It has been this year. It's called A Different Perspective, and
right.
It's
okay.
kevinrandle.blogspot.com.
Yeah.
And it was just this year I started doing the chasing footnotes because in doing research for this book, I was looking for sightings that predated sightings of discs predating Arnold, and there was one that's mentioned in, I think, the UFO Evidence by Dick Hall, and it's mentioned in a lot of places from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and it was printed in the newspaper for July 23rd. And I'm thinking, all right. I went to the Cedar Rapids Library. I pulled the Cedar Rapids Gazette for July 23rd. It's not there. I looked. I did find the story. It actually appears a few days later, so it appears after the Arnold sighting, and it's not from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. It's from Joliet, Illinois. but the original story in Dick Hall's UFO Evidence, it talks about it June 23rd, Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So I chased it down and couldn't find it, and was very disappointed because I would like to find some sightings of disc-shaped craft prior to Arnold's flying saucer description.
Right.
But that's kind of what got me started on this chasing footnotes to their end. So I'll look something up and I'll try to chase it from A to B to see what the real story is. And unfortunately, too often it either ends in a dead end or the story is not as accurate as it could be.
All right. So I'm going to say, like, if you can, within a minute or two, can you talk about the MJ-12 documents? This is a question up on the that was real quick.
The key, there's three key documents, which is the Eisenhower briefing document, the Truman memo, and the Cutler-Twining memo. The problem is, in the Eisenhower briefing document, there's a reference to a Del Rio UFO crash in December of 1950. The source of that is a guy named Robert Willingham, and it turns out he's told the story. He's given the date of the crash 3 different times. He's given it in 3 different locations. He claimed to be an Air Force fighter pilot and a retired Air Force colonel. He was neither one of those things. And if you've got a story that's a hoax in the MJ-12 documents, what does that tell you about the rest of it?
Well, I said that to Stan Friedman, and he misunderstood me, and this was out in Phoenix. I said to him, I do, I'm into paintings, and I do a lot of authenticating. If I see a whole house full and there's one painting that it's a definite fake, then I suspect everything. It's hard to believe in the rest.
Well, but here's the point. If the document is real, the guys who wrote it knew this was a hoax. Willingham eventually said that he didn't tell the story until 1954. Well, if the Eisenhower briefing was made in he didn't tell the story until 1968, and I actually found the original article in MUFON, it was Skylook from March of 1968. But he later said, well, it happened in the mid-1950s. He told me, I think, 1954. Well, if the Eisenhower briefing document was written in 1952, how could this story that evolved in 1954 be in the Eisenhower briefing document? It's clear the Willingham story is a fake, and to me that tells me that whole entire document is a fake. There are other problems with it like that. The Truman memo, Peter Titelli, question document expert, looked at it and said the Truman signature at the bottom is a lift from another authentic document.
Yeah, and also they had the auto pen. There's all different types of ways that can be done. It can be done. It's been done in a million Abraham Lincoln pieces.
Oh yeah.
There's all that is always going on. Another question that was up on the message board, and this will probably be the final one, is what do you think of the Betty and Barney Hill case?
Interesting. There was just something on over the weekend about that story on one of the programs on the cable.
They're going to be producing a movie, remaking a movie,
and that's like we need another Barney and Betty Hill movie. Well, the problem is the star map, which is one of the key elements, it turns out that our astronomical knowledge has increased quite a bit, and some of the assumptions made by Marjorie Fish turn out to be untrue. I mean, at the time she made them, they were accurate. They're now inaccurate. The distance to some of the stars is either further or closer, and she eliminated all red dwarfs from the star map, or from our local part of the galaxy, because there'd be nothing interesting around a red dwarf, and we find that many of them actually have planets as well. So there might be something interesting. So she eliminated a great body of because there's so many red dwarfs, she couldn't get them all in. So there's some real problems with the story. I think Betty Hill was telling the truth as best she could. I just am not convinced she was abducted.
Mm-hmm. And Barney?
Barney, they were telling the truth as best they could tell it. I think Barney picked up an awful lot of the detail from Betty. They may have had an actual UFO sighting, and then as they talked about it and stuff, the story sort of evolved, and Betty was talking about her dreams being very, very vivid, and I think that was sort of incorporated into the entire tale. I know Stan will disagree with me, and Kathleen Marden, who I know will disagree with me, but that's kind of where I think we are on that.
Okay, we got like 30 seconds left, and just in that 30 seconds, in your book, what would you say the most incredible finding?
I think.
Go ahead.
Looking at the 1957 sightings, November of 1957 sightings, and the ones that came out of White Sands, because those have been pretty well overlooked in all of our research into the 1957. I think those are going to become much more important because I was able to interview one of the guys involved in it. I think they saw the object very, very close, and I think there was a real point of cover up there.
Is that the one that shows the glowing object coming in and crashing?
No, this is
a whole different one.
It actually lands, I think, on White Sands, and it lands in front of the mountain.
Right. Yeah.
But they're told, well, it was the moon or it was Venus or some crap like that, and then 12 hours later, another group of MPs see a similar thing. 3 of the MPs were interviewed by the Air Force. The 4th one was not, because he was supposedly on a 3-day pass. The story I hear is he was in the hospital.
Oh,
and
okay.
I'm trying to verify that information, and I have been working on that for like 8 months now, and have not been able to get any additional information.
Well, thanks so much, Kevin. It's been a real pleasure.
I've done the best I could on such short notice.
You did great. Okay. So I want to thank everyone for helping out with the show. Keith Rowland for helping out with the live show. Peggy for helping out with the Facebook page. Next week we have David Jacobs coming on, and we have to wrap it up right here. So I want to thank everyone for supporting the show, and we'll talk to you next week. Remember, you can listen to the shows live here on the Dark Matter Radio Digital Network every Wednesday at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.